Hello and welcome to the fourth installment of our Black History Now 2025 lecture series. I'd like to give a special thank you to Mayor Shannon Glover and the City Council for taking the time to attend this event. Their support and backing has been instrumental to the success and growth of our Black History Now program over the years. So Black History Now was started in 2016 with the intention of highlighting the African American voices, stories, and histories that have defined Portsmouth and Hampton Roads, but have too often been neglected or underrepresented in classrooms, textbooks, or popular media. We've been able to highlight these stories, scholars, and community members by expanding Black History Now, and instead of only celebrating Black history for 1 month, we instead celebrate it throughout the year with lectures, programs, and exhibits. Please make sure you do check out the program's website at blkhistorynow.com to stay up to date with our programming. New events will pop up on there throughout the year. I believe our next one will be 2 Saturdays from now, and then we'll see more pop up after that. Now today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, the Endowed Professor of Virginia Black History and Culture and Emeritus Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies at Norfolk State University, to present her talk, The Long Road to Freedom, Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. Dr. Newby-Alexander has published numerous works on African American history in the United States and Hampton Roads, and is one of the leading scholars in her field. And to give opening remarks, please everyone give a hand for Mayor Glover.
Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon to this wonderful presentation. I am just as excited about it as you are. One of the things that I have learned is that history matters, and Black history in specific and in particular matters for all of the reasons that Dr. Hogan just spoke of. But I want to submit to you a greater ideal to take away from today. Black history is American history, 100%. And I know some folks have forgotten that over time, but it truly is. And history comes with many facets, but it is the stories woven into the culture that make us great. So let me get to the real reason I came up here. The next lady, amazing lady that you are going to hear, was my history professor at Norfolk State University. Some of you may know part of my major in interdisciplinary studies was African American studies. And under her tutelage, I learned more about myself and Black history than any other time in my life. Just so you know, she is not to me just a history professor, and a very good one at that, but she is a personal friend. And anytime that I have questions related to history, I'll call on Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. So I welcome you to our great city of Portsmouth, and thank you for coming.
You know, I'm so glad Mayor Glover made the statement that American history is Black history. You know, I'm reminded of what Thomas Jefferson said in his notes on Virginia, in which he believed that America could never be a biracial society. And he wasn't saying that there could not be blacks and whites in society. What he was saying is that American society had to be, in his mind, solely focused on whites. And of course, the opposite has been true, because our world, our society, does not operate in these small spaces. It was only in the 20th century that we falsely created a world of segregation that separated groups of people who normally interacted with one another on a regular basis every minute of every day. We forget that at the very beginning, when a handful of Africans were forced to come here in 1619, that most of them disappeared. They disappeared as being African, and their descendants were eventually white, because they intermingled, intermarried with whites and with some native peoples and disappeared as a result. And many people today are walking around with that DNA in them and have no idea. That is American history. That history that we are still uncomfortable with. And I plan on making you even more uncomfortable today talking about this story. Hopefully not uncomfortable to the point that you're angry because I mean, whatever those issues are, I'm going to leave them over here. But the discomfort should be, why don't I know this information? That should be your discomfort. Why don't I know this information? So I always have to have a clock because, as you can tell already, I love to talk. And I love to talk about this particular subject. I want to start with Lonnie Bunch, who I understand they're trying to push out as the director of the Smithsonian because he is not for this erasure of Black history from American history. But as the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian and the former director, the founding director actually of the National Museum for African American History and Culture, he said that the African American experience is the lens through which we understand what it really is like being an American. On July 5th, 1852, the most well-known freedom seeker in the Western world took to the stage in Rochester, New York, and delivered one of America's most important reality checks. It was part of the celebration, an ongoing celebration of July 4th. This speech happened on July 5th. And he entitled his speech, The Meaning of July 4th for the Negro. Douglass said, quote, "The 4th of July is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. There is consolation," and I'm kind of telescoping a lot of what he said because it was an 18-page speech. But he said, "There is consolation in the thought that America is young. It's only 76 years old for human beings. That's old for a nation that's young." He said that that's a good thing because all of the ideas that were embedded in the nation were still fairly recent and could possibly be changed. He said, "I've said that the Declaration of Independence is the ringbolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to those principles. In all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost." He said, "Fellow citizens, I'm not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men. They loved their country better than their own private interests." But he continued and he said, "But what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than any other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Now, it's amazing that after just that part of his speech, which was only halfway through, he wasn't kicked off the stage, but he wasn't. They listened. Why did they listen? Because this was 1852, 2 years after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. He had been a freedom seeker since the 1840s. He was still a fugitive from slavery. He could at any point in time be arrested and thrown back into slavery or even killed at any point in time. And so he was speaking from his experiences. He wasn't speaking about lofty ideals. But what he did in that speech was he presented this dichotomy in America. The ideals that were embedded in the Declaration of Independence and how those ideals were thrown away when it came to making money on the backs of black people. And it's important to know both of those things existed at the same time, which is why he juxtaposed those two things at the same time, in the same speech. He lauded, he applauded the idealism of the Declaration of Independence and the bravery of those who created it and signed it, because they were signing their death warrant when they signed that document. But he also said, but look at what you're doing as a nation. Look at the harm, look at the cruelty, the bloodletting that went on. Now, if you think that I'm being a little too harsh, all you have to do is delve into some of these accounts, and you will see that I'm not being harsh enough. When you read some of the things, and you know, I'm old. I've been reading this stuff for 40 years. Actually, more than 40 years. And at this point, you would say, well, there's not much more you can read that's new that would make you have to put something down for a minute. But trust me, I still encounter those things. And I remind people that, you know, in the 18th and 19th century, prostitution wasn't illegal, but child prostitution was, unless you were black. And then you had no choice. You had well, you didn't have any choice if you were black, whether you were a prostitute or not, but child prostitution was legal. And the lighter skinned you were, the more they wanted you in those houses of prostitution. And so we forget that these protections that were put in place for children as well as for human beings were there in part because of our past and our past harm. Now, this speech really also frames a perspective by putting blacks in the center of the story, by juxtaposing these two very different dichotomous ideals. Douglass was aware that there were blacks who fought in the American Revolution. But his point was not that they weren't a part of this. His point was that America violated their promise to all Americans. They had violated it to the point that 5 years later, after his speech, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, would render a decision that would snatch citizenship rights from all black people, including those who had generationally been citizens, by declaring that all black people, whether free or enslaved, were not human beings and therefore could not have citizenship rights. That's a part of our American history. That's why the 14th Amendment was so important. That's why today you have people talking about snatching back the 14th Amendment and leaving the Dred Scott decision in place. So you have to understand why people are saying what they're saying in order to understand and what they're really talking about. And history, being ignorant of history, is very detrimental, extremely detrimental. You know, it was in the 1800s that an abolitionist by the name of William Cooper Nell held up the death of Crispus Attucks as the first martyr of the American Revolution in that 1770 Boston Massacre. And I've juxtaposed these three images, all created at different points in time. This last one down here, which was actually the first one, was done by Paul Revere. And I don't know how well you can see it, but you don't see any black people in that image. And yet, everyone in Boston knew there was a black man who was the first to fall. And so there has been a remaking even shortly after the incident to erase black people from the picture by individuals who call themselves patriots. Nell, of course, talks about Crispus Attucks and highlights his death as the cause for liberty. Black Bostonians, though, kept his memory alive for years and celebrated, commemorated the anniversary of his death for years and years and years. In the early 1900s, William Monroe Trotter, who was a newspaper publisher, also pushed out the story of Crispus Attucks. And of course, over in Norfolk, African Americans built an entire theater and named it after Crispus Attucks and had a curtain commissioned with that scene because they wanted people to remember this history and to see it in a public space so that everyone could see it. It could be a constant reminder that not only were blacks there during the American Revolution, but we helped to fight for freedom. Because the freedom that blacks were trying to obtain was the basic human freedom. It wasn't the same kind of freedom that the founding fathers were trying to obtain. Their freedom was about political freedom. But for black people, it was about their human freedom. So with the outbreak of the war that happened a little bit later on, at Lexington and Concord, in April of 1775, Virginia, of course, was quickly on the side of the Patriots, with the exception of our area. Right here in Portsmouth, Norfolk, we were part of what they call the Tory town. We were the Tories, the supporters of England. Why? Because so many of our goods were shipped directly to England. That was our financial bread and butter. And so our allegiance and alliance was directly to England. So that is why it was easier, put quotes around there, for Benedict Arnold to establish a fort right here, not too far from this site. And why you had a number of people who supported him. But then, you know, like most things, people are temporary in their support. It all depends upon which way that wind blows. And so here in what they call the lower Tidewater region, where Loyalist support was still pretty strong, it had 6,000 people here. Many of them were affluent merchants. And let me just put a caveat here. When you think of merchants, most of the time you think of goods flowing back and forth, correct? But the merchants here didn't just have goods flowing back and forth. They had human beings flowing back and forth. And this was not a huge import area, but a lot of the merchants had port areas and wharves in other cities that were big in the transatlantic slave trade. Of course, up on the York River, that was a big transatlantic slave trading depot. And then you had, of course, this area with people going into North Carolina, especially eastern North Carolina. So these individuals who were here were very much in support of the loyalists. They were loyalists, and they were very much in support of the British. That's also, of course, why Lord Dunmore, John Dunmore, who had been, interestingly, he was a good friend of George Washington's. They exchanged a lot of social capital between one another. And it wasn't until this time period that they divided, of course, in terms of what they would support. And so John Dunmore continued, of course, to support England. He was an earl in England. He was not going to let go of his title or his properties in England or his social status. He was, of course, in Williamsburg operating as the governor. So the Norfolk area was very much, you had, I would say, about maybe a third of the population. They were against the British and the British rule. They were hearing and reading about all the things going on in New England, and of course, down in this area as well, you had others who were looking at their pocketbooks, their wallets, kind of like what we're doing right now with the stock market, and trying to decide who are we going to support based on how much money is coming in. Now, I want to pause for a minute and just tell you that there were a number of black people at Lexington and Concord. There were a lot of blacks who served as Minutemen. There were a number of them who served in Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys. And in fact, at Lexington and Concord, it was one of the African American men who, Salem Poor, who actually shot the commander of the British forces. They, of course, were patriots, and he shot the one at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So there's a long history of African Americans. In fact, there were 50 who were actually named, who were part of the Minutemen who fought in this historic battle. And I wanted to mention some of the names of the others that we know of at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was actually fought on Breed's Hill, but people knew Bunker Hill more, so they talked about Bunker Hill. But it was men such as Titus Coburn, Peter Salem, Seymour Burr, and of course, Salem Poor. It's important for you to know the names of some of these men, because often when you're talking about African Americans in this time period, you just hear a man, an enslaved man, an enslaved woman. By removing names, you remove people's humanity. And so it's important, as they say, to say the name. That's why blessings always include names. Because when you speak the name, you speak something very important into the air. Here in the Norfolk Portsmouth region, there were a number of enslaved blacks who, even before Lexington and Concord, as the British were coming into this area regularly, they began to run away to the British lines. No one told them to run away. They just started to do it on their own. And they started in increasingly larger numbers. In that April of that same year, we would see a number of owners complaining about how too many of their enslaved people were running away. And so Virginia started to make some efforts to address that issue, especially by mid-1775. And John Dunmore was actually one of those who was trying to address it. He knew that people were losing money once their enslaved property ran away from them. And so he wasn't interested at that time in utilizing African Americans to help him win the war or to help him fight and to put down the rebellion. What is interesting is that we would see a number of ads, such as one that was published in the Virginia Gazette in the spring of 1775 that said, "Runaway, a likely Negro fellow named Tom, his back much marked by whipping. By trade, a carpenter. I forewarn all masters of vessels from taking him out of the colony at their peril." And of course, this reference was actually to British ships. Another ad said, "Runaway, a likely Negro fellow named London, about 25 years of age, 5 feet 10 or 11 inches high, can read and write. Pretty artful, and no doubt will endeavor to ship himself on board some outbound vessel." And these were just two examples of hundreds of ads that came out complaining about how people might be leaving. Some white Norfolkians held on to their human property by fleeing the area, and we found that there were some from Portsmouth, there were some from Princess Anne County, as well as Nazareth County, who were doing the same thing. But the real break between the general white population in Virginia and the governor happened in June, when Lord Dunmore, fearing for his life, fled the governor's palace in Williamsburg and sought refuge on a British ship in the York River. A few days later, his ship, called the Otter, had joined several other naval vessels on the eastern branch of the Elizabeth River. Now, the sentiment was strong, as I said, here in this area, and so the British warships typically landed down in this area in friendlier waters. The most ardent patriots left Norfolk and joined the militia groups and units assembling at Kemp's Landing, which, of course, you know is Virginia Beach, as well as Great Bridge, which is now Chesapeake. And there were a few other strategic points where they gathered. In October, there was a general exodus that took place in this region. And in this area, Church Street and the road to Great Bridge were crowded with a lot of patriots, many of them driving carts loaded with household goods and so forth. And so I wanted to show you this map so that you could see kind of where things were. Of course, I didn't zero in on how there were only a handful of roads in the, kind of like today, there are only a handful of roads in this area. And all of those roads that are a handful of roads go either north, south, east, or west. And there's only one major one going in each of the directions, which is why there's such a concentration of traffic on those roads. How did most people travel during this time? By water. How do most people travel today? By land, by road. And they travel by water because if you pay attention on every single road that you travel down, if it rains and floods, that used to be a creek bed. And so we drained some of it temporarily, but the water does come back whenever it rains. Why? Because where you are right now is the outskirts of the Dismal Swamp. The Dismal Swamp at one point was 1 million square miles. 1 million acres, 1,000 square miles. Sorry about that. 1 million acres, 1,000 square miles. That was the original swamp. And so the outskirts of the swamp was right here. And what happens when you're in a swamp? A lot of water, a lot of marshy land, and very few roads. In fact, half of what we call Old Town Portsmouth, the reason they built all of the houses on stilts so that the first floor is really like the second floor is because it always flooded. Because this is marshland. So just in case you didn't know where you live, so when we talk about global warming and rising tides, we've been in rising tides as long as Portsmouth has existed. It's just that now it's getting higher. It's not new, it's just getting higher. All right, back to my story. This is a picture of Lord Dunmore. During the summer of 1775, Dunmore started accepting blacks to augment his tiny force of 300 loyalists, white loyalists and seamen. But it wasn't an official policy. He wanted to get permission from England to do what he was already doing. In August, crew members on the British sloops started inviting blacks to board the vessels. The Virginia Gazette in August of 1775 reflected local unease about this because as he invited them to get on these ships, they weren't being taken someplace, they were being utilized as soldiers. That means they were given a gun, or they were taught how to fire a cannon, or some other kind of military training. This frightened slaveholders in this area because, as Jefferson put it, slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't dare let it go for fear that it will turn on you and kill you. And so there was this constant fear, even in the revolutionary period, that black people, once freed, would do nothing other than try to kill white people first before they would do anything else. And of course, the opposite was actually true for 99.99999% of black people. They simply wanted to be free. By October, the region's enslaved population had more news to cheer about when the Virginia Gazette reported that, quote, Lord Dunmore sails up and down the river, and where he finds a defenseless place, he lands, plunders the plantation, and carries off all the Negroes. Efforts by freedom seekers gave Dunmore the idea he could take advantage of the large population that was here of enslaved people. And he was increasingly more receptive to that idea. It took him a while until his proclamation in November 7th, 1775. And we're about to have a program in October to commemorate that signing of the proclamation so that we can talk about what this meant for America. He urged all able-bodied servants to leave their masters and join him in crushing the rebellion, convinced that only the most complete chastisement of the rebellious colonists would bring them to terms. His decree also was accompanied by imposing martial law. The governor believed that this would be especially effective in places such as this. Dunmore initially planned to use his Ethiopian regiment as a threat to slaveholding colonial Virginians who wanted to rebel and who were used as sappers. And sappers are people who would build fortifications, trenches, bridges, and roads. Now, I want to pause for a minute because I want to talk about that word, Ethiopian regiment. You know, unlike today where most people only know the continent of Africa and they use that word like it's a country, like they're talking about a country, people of this time knew the different African nations. You had Yoruba land. You had Senegambia. You had Benin, Kingdom of Dahomey. And this is just the West Africa, but you know, you had the Congo. you had many different nations that people knew about. But the one nation that was isolated from all of the slave trading was Ethiopia. It was the one nation that actually would remain independent of any European colonization until the First World War. And what hurt them was the development of airplanes. That's what allowed them to be conquered, because their nation was on a plateau, and that gave them an advantage. And so Ethiopia in this time period was used often as a suggestion for empowerment. It wasn't just a random word. So if you called somebody an Ethiopian, you were basically saying they were free, independent, and powerful. So I want you to understand why he selected that word. It was not random, and it was not out of ignorance. It was out of sending a message that was very clear. Approximately 200 enslaved people from Hampton Roads joined Lord Dunmore within 1 week of this proclamation being issued. And even though it was issued in Williamsburg, somehow they heard about it down here, because nothing travels faster than word of mouth. And that includes your text messages and any kind of social media posts. Nothing travels faster than that. In total, approximately 850 men fought in Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment, while records show that 1,100 to 1,200 enslaved men, women, and children left to join Lord Dunmore. You know, even though Dunmore had the call for able-bodied men, it didn't stop women and children from going. And what's interesting is he did what later General Benjamin Butler would do. When those men began to flee to Fort Monroe in 1861, there were women and children who also fled. And instead of turning them away, Butler allowed them to come in. The same thing happened with Lord Dunmore. This edict, as you know, absolutely alarmed the white population in Virginia. Why? Because he's talking about organizing these men as soldiers. So if you're already afraid that your enslaved person, if freed, would kill you, how better to kill you than to be given a weapon and authority to do it? And so Dunmore, and I don't know if it was just complete ignorance on his part, but he thought this would frighten the white population enough to surrender. But instead, it enraged them. And so the opposite actually happened. The limitation then on trying to just get these able-bodied men, even though a lot of women came in, really meant that people who weren't on necessarily the Patriot side, fear caused them to be on the Patriot side. And so you started to see a lot of white families aligned with the Patriots more than they were before. Once the proclamation was issued, places like Princess Anne County, there were a lot of people there who complained that all the blacks on their plantations left, just got up and left. They ran away, they boarded British ships, and in so many cases, so many of these individuals said 15, 20, 70 people would leave at one time. In Norfolk County, plantation owners were petitioning Virginia for the return of their enslaved people, some of whom had actually been captured while trying to flee. There was one particular man by the name of Cuffy who was captured by the Virginia forces right here in Portsmouth. He was taken to the Suffolk jail because he was trying to get, and he was actually trying to join Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment. And his owner was actually petitioning then the officials to return his slave to him. Interestingly, they never did. What happened to him, we don't know. So many of the enslaved people who escaped from their owners to join the Lord Dunmore's regiment created such concern that in April of 1776, the Virginia Convention ordered, that all the enslaved people in Norfolk, Portsmouth, Princess Anne counties, that they all had to leave the area because this is where you had a concentration of enslaved black people at this particular time. But of course, plantation owners were very reticent to do that. How would they then remove their enslaved population? Where would they go? How could they continue to make money? And so a lot of them didn't want to do that. Then eventually the order was modified to only those who were capable of joining Lord Dunmore, so within a certain age range, male of course, as well as strong, no physical defects, they had to leave. And so this drawing that was done at the time when this was the issue, so many people were being forced to push many of their enslaved people out. Now, the year after Dunmore's proclamation was issued, the Virginia Council decreed that counties with navigable rivers and any kind of creeks or waterways should position guards around all the boats so that blacks who might use them to escape will be deterred. Virginia Governor Patrick Henry asked the council to advise him on how to restrict blacks from fleeing from Northampton and Accomack County. So we're talking about the Eastern Shore now. So desperate were Virginia slave owners to secure the return of these men, women, and children that the Virginia Council permitted 2 American officers to board ships, British ships, at the York and Hampton to request their return. Local whites tried practical ways of stopping escaping people by stepping up slave patrols. You know, slave patrols are like ICE today. They were empowered. And I'm making these statements because I want you to see connections in history, how when people come up with these ideas, they're not new. So slave patrols were empowered to go into people's homes. So if you were on a plantation and there was a slave cabin, you could go in that home and you could look to find if there's any writing material, if there are any books, if there are people who should be there who are missing, or people who shouldn't be there who are. You were empowered to whip someone at will, to beat them up at will. And of course, in cities where most enslaved people did not live with their owners, they were empowered to go into homes where African Americans who were enslaved were renting rooms and to pull out anybody that they suspected. And if you didn't have a pass, or sometimes if you did have a pass, that pass might have been torn up and you were arrested anyway. So these slave patrols were given tremendous power to wreak havoc on people with impunity, with no punishment. And they could violate your basic human rights at will. And so the area stepped up these patrols. They also were busy patrolling the wharves to catch anybody trying to get aboard any of Dunmore's fleet. And they caught a number of people. Well, the first major encounter between the Patriots and the British forces occurred in November of 1775, a few miles outside of Norfolk at Kemp's Landing, which is in Princess Anne County. Many of those who fled from Norfolk assembled at this little island deep water harbor. Dunmore's forces included about 300 black Marines, and the Patriots proved no match to this group. They were routed after one musket fire, and one of the leaders was killed. Several people actually were killed on the field, 2 drowned in this particular effort to flee. It was essentially a lot of chaos that occurred. During the skirmish, Colonel Hutchins of the Princess Anne County Militia was surprised by a detachment of Lord Dunmore's black soldiers, and he and the men fled into the swamps in the area. Now, in Virginia Beach, around Kemp's Landing, you have 2 main swamps, the Rainbow and the Ball Cypress swamps, but you have a bunch of others. So you have a lot of smaller swamps in Virginia Beach, and of course, the big Dismal Swamp in this area. By the 1st of December, Dunmore had successfully outfitted nearly 300 former enslaved men in military garb, and they wrote across their chests, "Liberty to slaves." Now, what that suggests to me is that some of them knew how to read and write. And this was seen as a very dangerous thing to slaveholders, that an enslaved person knew how to read and write. Blacks were used, as I said, in the Navy. They were used in every capacity. Then, of course, in December, December of 1775, you had the Battle of Great Bridge. That was the next major action in which the Ethiopian regiment was engaged. It was about 10 miles south of Norfolk, and was such an important strategic point because it guarded the land as you're approaching to the city. In fact, when you think of Great Bridge, that's a land bridge. It is the only part, or the only piece of land that connects Norfolk, the city of Norfolk, to the continent of North America. Otherwise, Norfolk would be an island. So if you're ever in Great Bridge when there's a thunderstorm, please go inside. Because, land bridges get it from every turn. It's just like I-95. Have you ever wondered why there are so many storms that hit I-95 more than any other place? Well, before that, the Chesapeake Bay was created by the meteorite. That was pretty much the beachhead. And so even though the landscape has changed, the wind and weather patterns have not. And beaches always get hit hard when there's storms. So part of what you have to understand about this region is you have to understand the geological history of this area, as well as the history of what people did and why they did it. Because the geography and the geology determine, to some degree, people's actions. So at the Battle of Great Bridge, the governor, even though his group was outnumbered, he was confident that they would be victorious. Unfortunately, he experienced what the British would later experience time and time again, and that is double agents. And blacks often served as double agents. They believed that every black who came to them was supportive of the British. Of course, blacks weren't supportive necessarily of the British. What were they supportive of? Freedom. And they didn't care which way they got it. Freedom. Because the white Americans were the British. And this is what, it is amazing to me. I did a documentary on the origins of slavery in America. And I actually had, it was a BBC documentary, I actually had some British citizens email me and said, I don't know why you said the British or the English started slavery in America. What are you talking about? I said, you do realize that America was founded by the British, or the English, I should say, before it became Britain. I said, so yes, they did start it. But that tells you how bizarre people think, and their lack of history. To say it's incredible is not even the right word. Eventually, you did have a man right here in Portsmouth named William Flora. He was actually a free black who fought for the Patriots, and he helped to provide intel that led to the defeat of the British. Following the defeat at Great Bridge, he also actually fought. See, this is me telling myself to be quiet. He was actually very important in the battle. So following this, the British really began to suffer some defeats. But black recruits continued to come into the British forces time and time and time again. I wanted to show you these images because at the top image, this is a very interesting picture because it looks like a patriot fighting with the British forces. The black man is a patriot because he has on blue and white, but he's actually one of the British soldiers, and they're involved in a battle. You had an unnamed black sailor. It would be wonderful to know the names of these people. That's why if you take photographs, please write down the names of people on your photographs, because over time we forget who those people are. And this, of course, shows, here's another picture that's showing recruits. The way that people wore their uniforms, it's just like during the Civil War. You can't always tell what side people are on by the color of their uniforms, because often the soldiers would wear gray or a greenish gray color uniform. Both sides would wear those colors, and so it's important that you understand you can't always tell what side the individuals were on. You have to look at the actual uniform to be able to tell. Here's another larger picture of some of these soldiers who were fighting, as well as, of course, I included once again this picture of Crispus Attucks being killed at the Boston Massacre. Just in the interest of time, I wanted to talk about some of these individuals who actually escaped, and they were not interested in who could provide them with freedom. Rather, they were interested only in freedom. One of those individuals was someone who was owned by John Willoughby. Now, you all have heard of Willoughby Spit, right? You all know it was created by a hurricane about 350 years ago. So that's an example of why would you build your house on sand? Okay, John Willoughby was a member of one of the oldest families in Virginia. He served as a lieutenant in the county militia, chair of the Norfolk County Committee on Safety. So he was very much involved in trying to ensure that not only are enslaved people not running away, but also that the pirates and others coming into our area did not create havoc. And it was during this period that people raised the question, where were his loyalties? Because it was during the time that Lord Dunmore was most active in 1775 that there were a number of Willoughby's enslaved men, women, and children who were seen getting aboard a boat and rowing to one of the British vessels. And so Willoughby denied actually letting them do that, but the signs seem to be that he was allowing them to go onto the British ships, not necessarily to gain their freedom, but to protect them so that he would hold on to them as enslaved people. There were hundreds of people, not as many as during the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, there were thousands of enslaved people who got aboard British ships and went up to Nova Scotia, one of the big places. Excuse me. But there were so many people who were going on to British ships because they saw that liberty was not applied here. You had, in this region especially, but throughout Virginia, you had a number of blacks who served on the side of the Patriots in exchange for freedom. But we know that by the end of the war, they were not freed. They were instead re-enslaved. One man in particular, James Fayette, he played a pivotal role at the final battle of Yorktown. We know that the Marquis de Lafayette, who was good friends with Thomas Jefferson, who actually abhorred slavery, and he and Jefferson always had fights going back and forth about slavery. And it was the Marquis de Lafayette who met James Fayette and wanted him to be part of his sort of small coterie of individuals. Fayette was enslaved from Gloucester County. He volunteered to join the Continental Army and served under the Marquis. In fact, 2 weeks after Lord Dunmore issued his proclamation, George Washington issued a proclamation indicating he would no longer enlist blacks in the Continental Army. So we know that there were a number of blacks who were serving prior to that. And then, of course, once he found out what Dunmore was doing, then he had to somewhat retract his refusal to allow blacks to join the Continental Army. There were a total of 5,000 black men who served as regulars in the Continental Army. That means that they served for most of the time. And then there were an additional 5,000 who served for a year or two in the Continental Army. Well, James Fayette then was one of those who served in the Continental Army, but the Marquis saw that he could actually serve very well as a spy, and he did so. He successfully infiltrated the headquarters of Benedict Arnold, so that means he was right here in Portsmouth. And James Fayette would actually be taken from camp to camp by Cornwallis and by the troops, as well as by Benedict Arnold, and he would hear all of their military intel, and he eventually would go and tell all this, or give all this information to the Marquis. He was so trusted that the last thing on their minds was that he was an agent. In fact, they had him spying for them, but they didn't realize he was a double agent, so he was giving them false intel. Eventually, Fayette gave enough information that allowed the American forces to win at the Battle of Yorktown. Now, one of the things that many people don't realize is there were blacks who fought on both sides at that particular battle. And I challenge America to finally do a recreation that's historically accurate. I challenge them to do that, because right now, there are very few African American men who have actually served as interpreters in those battles, and if they are, it's only on one side versus the other. When there was a fairly large number, there are estimates of up to 1/4 or even 1/3 of the troops who served during that battle. Fayette, interestingly, at the end of the war, went back to his owner. His owner re-enslaved him. The Marquis de Lafayette found out this is what happened, and he started putting pressure on the Virginia government to free him, which he finally was freed. And Fayette was given land and became a farmer, an important farmer, had a pension. Well, initially he didn't have a pension because they were only giving pensions to soldiers, not spies. So people who served, there were women who served as spies. Harriet Tubman, for example, was never able to get a pension, even though she led troops into battle, because she was a woman, because the law only allowed men, male soldiers, to get a pension. Historian Benjamin Quarles talked about how tens of thousands of enslaved men and women at the end of the war did not wait around to be enslaved. They got aboard British ships, and the British were in negotiations with America about, paying American slaveholders for the loss of their slaves, but they didn't do it. They did almost none of that. They simply took them. In fact, they went to New York, and from there they left, and the Americans were very angry. They took them up to Canada, to a new colony called Nova Scotia, and of course the settlement of Halifax. And that is where some of their descendants who left from this area still reside. In fact, I've met some of the descendants. I've listened to some of the storytelling where they're telling these folk tales, and they sound like they're from here. There are certain phrases that you hear people say around here. I don't know where they come from. I would love to know, but they'll say, I'm gonna make groceries. It's like, what are you talking about? How can you make groceries? But it is a way that people are using language that's interesting and is straight from here. In people who say, sweep the flow and shut the door, they're saying the same thing. Now, of course, not now. The younger people aren't, but the older people used to use those same pronunciations. So it is interesting that they're keeping that history alive. Benjamin Quarles said that 3/4 of enslaved blacks who escaped to the British made their way by waterway where the ships were anchored. And it's evident, of course, that they had lots of opportunities here in Virginia because the waterways, it's difficult even to differentiate between a creek and a river and the Chesapeake Bay. And I challenge you, as you're driving down 264, are you on a river? Are you on a creek? Are you on the bay? And it's like almost the whole way there. And when you're crossing through the downtown tunnel and you go past Norfolk State, is that a river that you cross over, or is that a creek? So you actually cross over 2 creeks. And of course you cross over a river. A lot of people don't realize that these waterways flow into each other. How they are named is really based on the size for the most part. I wanted to mention this last thing. One of the people who left from this area, and she initially went to Halifax, but then didn't like it because she saw and found there was so much prejudice there that she wanted a better place, a place where she was accepted. And she married a man while they were waiting in New York City for the ship to leave, named Caesar. And when they went to Nova Scotia, they eventually left from there. Birchtown, by the way, is still remembered by a museum. That's a little section, a little neighborhood of Halifax. And she eventually then went to Sierra Leone. That was a colony established by the English, just as the Americans established the colony of Liberia in the 19th century. In the late 18th century, the British established Sierra Leone for those who had been enslaved and who were now free. My final statement is that there are many, 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 many stories to tell. Not enough time to tell them all. But some of you are future historians, future researchers, and I want to challenge you because there are a lot of people, as I said, who are descended from those who fought on both sides. Find those descendants so that we can begin to reconnect people. Many of the white loyalists were not forced to leave the area. In fact, they continued to be prominent merchants in the area, and all was forgiven. But for those who were black, their only choice for freedom was to leave. For those who stayed and fought for the Americans, Virginia actually had to pass on a law to force owners to free those people. And we would see the rise of the free black population, not just because of the war, but also because of a religious movement called the Great Awakening that convinced people that what they were doing was wrong. Holding people in bondage was wrong. And so we would see a rise, an official rise from 10,000 in 1790 to over 100,000 10 years later of free blacks. This created another issue as far as America was concerned, because what do you do with people who are afraid to have free black people in America? Now you're talking about a biracial society. So this is just a sampling of some of the people who left. And, you know, there were no dictionaries at this time, so you'll see a lot of names not spelled the way we spell them today, a lot of words not necessarily spelled that way. But Princess Anne County, you had Effie Warner, who had two sons. You had Betsy Robertson, who was formerly owned by a captain from Portsmouth. You had Nancy Walker. You know, what was interesting to me were all the women who were listed as leaving, because I don't know why, but people don't think women are dangerous. And I have not figured that out yet, why people don't think women are dangerous. But a lot of the women actually served as spies, although you do have some stories of women actually getting involved in the fighting. So here we have from the first arrival of Africans in 1619 until this period. What the story that you see is one of agency. People who were captured, who were forced to come to this country from the beginning. Their first and foremost goal was freedom. They fought for it, some died for it, sometimes they ran away to achieve it. In fact, Thomas Jefferson claimed that over 50,000 enslaved people disappeared during the American Revolution. Some of them were on British ships leaving. Some of them simply disappeared. That means that they moved to other locations and started families and communities in other places. But what you see first and foremost is black agency. That means that they made their own decisions, they used their legs, their arms to achieve the freedom that we claimed we supported in this country when we sign this important document that says we hold these truths to be self-evident. that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for these individuals, they decided to make America truly a land of freedom for themselves. Sometimes that freedom had to occur elsewhere. Thank you all so much.
And so we'd like to thank you all for coming out today and attending Dr. Newby-Alexander's lecture. And if you could just give her another round of applause. We really appreciated you coming and giving the talk today. Our next lecture will take place in this room on April 26th at 1:30 p.m. when artist and Portsmouth native Tony Snipes presents on how the Norfolk Naval Shipyard and Lightship Portsmouth influenced his art and how he was able to turn his passions into a successful and thriving business. We hope that you'll join us for that exciting lecture and his exciting presentation. Please remember there are refreshments in the back of the room, and do not forget to check out the amazing exhibit behind you, Glenn McClure's Waves of Strength, which looks at the contributions of African American shipyard workers here in Hampton Roads. So thank you again for coming out today.